There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists after the end of the world. It is not the quiet of a library or the hushed silence of a church or even the still, breathless pause before a storm. It is something older than those things, something heavier. It is the quiet of a planet exhaling not in relief but in grief. A planet that has watched its most ambitious species reach the peak of its terrible cleverness, and then in the span of 72 hours use that cleverness to unmake itself. I know that quiet well. I helped create it. My name is Adam Carver. I am 38 years old, though I feel considerably older most mornings when I pry myself out of the cot I've set up in what used to be the manager's office of a farm supply store in what used to be called Millhaven, Tennessee. The store's sign still hangs out front, one corner drooping, the letters sun-bleached from green to a pale, ghostly gray. It reads, Millhavenag and feed. I've left it up on purpose. Not out of sentimentality for what was, but as a reminder of what could be again. Feed, agriculture, the ordinary, stubborn miracle of planting something in the ground and watching it grow. 10 years. It has been 10 years since the missiles flew. 10 years since the sky turned the wrong colors, first the blinding, terrible white of detonation, then the bruised purples and blacks of nuclear winter, and finally, slowly, the washed-out hazy blue-gray that passes for sky now. The clouds are thinner than they used to be. Not gone, but changed. Everything is changed. I look at myself most mornings in the cracked piece of mirror I've propped against the wall above the old utility sink. The man looking back at me is not someone the 28-year-old version of me would recognize immediately. The hair is darker than it used to be. Sun and ash will do that. Steal the lightness right out of a person. There are lines in my face that have no business being there on a 38-year-old. But then, I've lived several lives in the span of these 10 years, so maybe they're earned. My jaw is heavier. My eyes are different. That's the thing I notice most when I'm honest with myself in those early morning moments before the settlement starts to stir and people start needing things from me. My eyes are different. They used to be certain. I remember that about myself. The young version of me, the soldier, the true believer, he looked out at the world with absolute, unshakable certainty. He knew what was right. He knew who the enemy was. He knew what had to be done, and he was willing to do it, and he slept just fine afterward. I don't sleep like that anymore. I sleep in pieces. An hour here, an hour there, punctuated by dreams that aren't really dreams so much as memories wearing dream clothes. Faces, numbers, coordinates. The clinical language of military operations layered over images that are anything but clinical. A city, a valley, a river delta that I knew from satellite imagery contained approximately 300,000 civilians alongside the military infrastructure we'd been tasked with eliminating. Collateral damage within acceptable parameters, someone had said in the briefing room. Maybe it was Colonel Hatch. Maybe it was me. I've tried and tried to remember whose voice it was, and I honestly can't anymore. I think that might be its own kind of mercy, and I think I don't deserve mercy, which is why I keep trying to remember. But that is the past. The present is this. 47 people call this settlement home. 47 living, breathing human beings who trust me, for reasons I sometimes find difficult to understand, to help keep them alive, to help build something worth living in, and to help figure out what kind of people we're going to be now that the old world's rules have been burned away along with most of the old world. 47 people. And yesterday, I spotted 3 figures on the ridge to the north, moving along the old logging road that comes down from the mountains. They were moving with the particular, practiced efficiency of people who have been trained to move that way. I recognized the way they walked before I recognized their faces. And when I recognized their faces, I sat down on the nearest thing available, a rusted barrel, and put my head in my hands and tried to remember the man I was trying to become, because the man I used to be was walking toward me through the ash-colored grass, and he was going to need an answer. This is the story of how I got here, all of it, the good and the terrible and the ordinary, which is sometimes the most important part. Part 1, Before the Fire. Chapter 1, The Making of a True Believer. I grew up in Cookeville, Tennessee, which is a perfectly ordinary small city in the middle of a state that takes a lot of pride in being exactly what it is. My father worked at a manufacturing plant that made automotive parts. My mother taught fourth grade. We had a house with a yard and a dog named Ranger, and a flag on the front porch that my father took in every night before dark because that was the proper way to do things. My father was not a complicated man, but he was a good one in the ways that matter most. He paid his bills. He told the truth. He coached my little league team for 4 years even though I was never particularly good, and it cost him every Saturday morning. He shook hands firmly and looked people in the eye, and believed with a completeness that I have come to envy that America was the greatest country on earth, and that being part of it carried with it a responsibility to protect it. He served in the First Gulf War, never talked about it much, had a shadow in him that came out sometimes at night when he thought the rest of us were asleep, and he'd sit in the kitchen with a glass of water and the light over the stove, and I would hear him from the hallway, just sitting there, breathing, alone with whatever lived in that shadow. I never asked him about it. I wish I had. I wish I'd sat down across from him at that kitchen table and said, "Dad, I need to know what war is actually like because I'm thinking about signing up, and I need to know the real version, not the brochure version." But I was 18, and 18-year-olds don't ask those questions. They join the army with their best friend Marcus Webb, and they go to basic training and they discover that they are, surprisingly, quite good at it. They are strong and they are fast and they are good with a rifle, and they have the particular psychological composition that the military values most in its junior enlisted. They follow orders, they don't ask too many questions, and they believe absolutely in the rightness of what they're doing. I was made for it, I thought, or it was made for me. I served 8 years as enlisted infantry before the opportunities presented themselves that moved me up the chain. I was smart. I don't say that with pride, just as a fact that shaped things. I tested well. I showed aptitude for strategic thinking. By the time I was 26, I'd been tapped for a joint intelligence and operations unit whose name I was told not to share publicly, which suited the version of me that existed then just fine. Secrets felt important. Secrets felt like power, and power felt like purpose. The unit I joined operated in a world of euphemisms. We didn't talk about killing. We talked about neutralizing threats. We didn't talk about civilian casualties. We talked about collateral impact assessments. We didn't talk about the political machinations that drove our targeting decisions, the backroom deals, the resource wars dressed in ideological clothing, the way that national security interests could be stretched to cover almost anything if you had the right people in the right rooms arguing for it. Colonel Raymond Hatch was my commanding officer for the last 3 years before everything ended. He was the most intelligent man I'd ever met, and I mean that without any qualification. He could walk into a room with a map on the wall and within 10 minutes have constructed a complete strategic picture that 3 analysts working for a week had failed to build. He was also utterly convinced, not just personally, but philosophically, structurally convinced, in the way that certain very smart men are convinced of things that cannot survive contact with reality, that there was a clean solution to what he called the civilizational conflict. I believed him. I want to be clear about that. I want to be honest about it in a way that is uncomfortable, because the comfortable version of this story has me as a man who was duped, manipulated, who didn't know what he was doing. And that version is partially true, but it is not completely true, and completely true is what I owe. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that there was no clean solution, that the conflict was messy and human and rooted in things that couldn't be bombed away, was a truth I wasn't ready for. The young version of me needed the world to be solvable, needed to believe that the right combination of force and strategy could carve out a permanent peace, that the violence we were doing now was a down payment on a future without violence. We were wrong about that. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. Chapter 2. The Event. I will not dwell long on the specifics of what we called in those final months the cascade. Not because I want to protect myself from accountability. That ship has sailed so far over the horizon it's not worth looking for, but because the specific political and military details of how the nuclear exchange started are, 10 years later, both complicated and somewhat beside the point. The point is, it started, and we were part of how it started, and then it was done. What I will tell you is this. There was a sequence of decisions made by people who thought they were being strategic, who thought they were playing a very sophisticated chess game on a global board, who were absolutely convinced that the other side would blink first. That's the thing they put in the history books when there were history books, that everyone was sure the other side would blink. Both sides. Everyone sure they were the ones with the steady nerve, the longer vision, the greater commitment to the outcome. Nobody blinked. I was in an operations center in a mountain installation in Colorado when the first confirmed detonation reports came through. We knew in the abstract that this was a possible outcome of the path we were on. We had wargamed it. We had protocols. What we did not have, what no protocol can give you, was any real preparation for the actual experience of watching a world end in real time on a series of screens, city after city. The reports coming in faster than the analysts could process them. The chain of command dissolving into something closer to paralysis than anything I'd been trained for. I remember thinking with a clarity that still unnerves me that I should feel more than I was feeling. I remember thinking, this is the thing. This is the thing we all knew could happen and refused to believe would happen, and it's happening, and I should be, what? Devastated, terrified. I remember mostly feeling very cold. A cold that started in my chest and spread outward. The kind of cold that isn't a temperature, it's an understanding. I had contributed to this. I had been a gear in the machine. Not the engineer, not the one who designed it, not the ones who made the final decision to arm and fire, but a gear. A functioning, willing, believing gear. And gears do not get to stand apart from what the machine produces. The installation stayed operational for 11 days after the initial exchange. Then the power grid failed in a cascade of its own, and the backup generators ran out of fuel, and the chain of command, what remained of it, issued something that stopped being orders and started being suggestions, and eventually stopped being anything at all. I walked out of that mountain on a Tuesday morning in November, 10 years ago, with a pack on my back and a rifle I hadn't fired in 3 weeks and the clothes I was wearing, and I started walking south toward Tennessee, because south was the direction of home, and home was the only concept I had left that meant anything. Chapter 3. The Long Walk. It took me 4 months to get back to Tennessee. I won't pretend those 4 months were purely a journey of the soul, a contemplative walk through the ruins that gradually transformed me into a wiser, more enlightened man. That's not how it works. The first 2 months were survival, pure and simple, finding food, finding water, avoiding the groups that had turned dangerous quickly, sleeping in places that could be defended, moving during the hours that seemed safest. The land was changed. The nuclear winter had set in with a thoroughness that the climate models had predicted, but that was still, in lived reality, stunning. The sky was the wrong color. The temperature was wrong for the season. The plants that survived were the tough ones, certain grasses, some trees, the stubborn, ugly vegetation that doesn't need much sun. The birds were thin on the ground. The insects were abundant in some places and entirely absent in others, in patterns that suggested something had gone badly wrong in the ecosystem. People were what I found in those 4 months, all kinds. I found a woman named Teresa who had been a high school biology teacher, and who, in the span of 60 days since the exchange, had basically become an agronomist out of pure necessity, figuring out which soils were still viable, which seeds from her school's garden club would germinate, how to build a cold frame. She was keeping 8 people alive in the community center of a small town in Kentucky, and she had charts on the wall and a system, and a level of calm practicality that I have tried to model ever since. I found a group of men in western Tennessee who had decided with great efficiency that the end of the old rules meant the beginning of their rules, and who were operating a checkpoint on what had been a state highway, taking what they wanted from travelers. I went around them. I've thought about that choice many times, whether I should have done something. The honest answer is that I was one person and they were seven, and I was conserving ammunition. And I told myself these things, and they were all true. And they were also a way of moving past a situation that would have cost me something to address. The third month I found Marcus. Marcus Webb, my best friend from Cookville. We'd enlisted on the same day, 17 years before. He'd gone a different direction than me through his military career. Infantry, then special operations, a unit that operated in places that weren't officially acknowledged. We'd stayed in touch imperfectly over the years, the way two people who grew up as close as brothers stay in touch when life pulls them different directions. Calls on birthdays, the occasional message, a genuine warmth that distance had not quite managed to erode. I found him in a farmhouse outside of Clarksville. He'd been there for 2 months with a group of 6 other former Special Operations soldiers. When I came up the drive and he came to the door and we recognized each other, the relief I felt was so overwhelming that I had to sit down on the porch steps. Just the presence of someone known, someone from the before. "I knew you'd make it," he said, and clapped me on the back, and it was almost like being 18 again for a moment. We sat up most of that night talking. And it was that night, I think, that I first began to understand how differently two people could process the same event. Because Marcus he was not grieving. He was not sitting with the weight of what had happened. He was energized. The old world was gone, and the way he talked about it, carefully at first and then less carefully as the night went on, it was clear that the old world was something he had been ready to be done with for a long time. "All those rules," he said, "all those restrictions, all those politicians and lawyers and activists getting in the way of what needed to be done, all of that's gone now, Adam. We get to start fresh. And this time, the people who know what they're doing get to be in charge." I didn't argue with him that night. I was too tired, too grateful for his company, too wrapped in the simple animal comfort of being among people I knew. But I heard something in what he was saying that put a small, cold stone in my stomach. I heard the certainty. The same certainty I used to carry. And for the first time, the very first time, sitting on that farmhouse porch with the wrong-colored sky overhead and the smell of ash still in everything, I wondered what that certainty had cost us. I stayed with Marcus and his group for 3 weeks, and then I kept walking south. Part 2, The Settlement. Chapter 4, Millhaven. I found Millhaven in the spring of year 1. Which is how I've started thinking about time, not in calendar years that correspond to nothing anymore, but in years since the Cascade. Millhaven wasn't a town of any significance in the before. About 1,200 people, mostly agricultural, strung along a valley between 2 ridges in Middle Tennessee. There was a gas station, a diner, a feed store, a Methodist church, a volunteer fire department, a consolidated elementary and middle school, and about 40 homes spread across the valley floor and the lower ridges. Of those 1,200 people, approximately 300 survived the first winter. The reasons for that brutal attrition were the reasons you'd expect. No power, no heat from any homes. Food that ran out before people figured out how to grow or find more. The accelerated spread of preventable illness among people whose immune systems were already compromised by stress and exposure, and several incidents of violence in those first chaotic weeks before the survivors organized themselves into something that resembled, if you squinted, a community. Alina Marsh was the reason they organized. She was 62 years old, had been the county extension agent for 20 years, and she possessed, I understood this the moment I met her, the most useful combination of skills possible for the situation. She knew how to grow food, she knew how to preserve food, She knew how to get people to work together, and she had absolutely no patience for nonsense of any kind. She found me sitting outside the feed store on a gray March morning, eating a can of beans I'd found in an abandoned house 3 miles back, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You were military." "Yes, ma'am." "What kind?" I told her. The full version, more than I'd told anyone. I don't entirely know why. Something about her that made evasion seem not worth the energy. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Can you build things?" "I can learn." "Can you lead people without making them feel like they're being led?" I thought about that. "I'm working on it." "Good enough," she said. "Come with me." That was the beginning. Alina ran Millhaven for the first 2 years, and I was one of her lieutenants, learning as much as I could as fast as I could about everything that the military had not taught me. How crops actually grow, how to build a functional water collection system, how to negotiate between two families who both want the same plot of land, how to make decisions that are good for a community rather than decisions that are good for an objective, how to lead people who have chosen to follow rather than people who have been ordered to. The military taught me 1,000 skills that have been useful in the last 10 years. It taught me logistics. It taught me how to assess terrain. It taught me first aid and basic construction and how to maintain equipment and how to think clearly under pressure. These things have value. I don't discard them. But Alina taught me something the military never did and couldn't have, given its nature and purpose. She taught me to lead by asking rather than telling, to solve problems with the community rather than for it, to sit with a difficult decision long enough to understand its second and third order effects on actual human beings rather than racing to the efficient outcome. She died in year 3, in the early fall, of an infection that started in a cut on her hand that we couldn't get properly clean, didn't have the antibiotics to fight, and didn't catch fast enough. She went from fine to gone in 11 days, and it was one of the hardest losses we've suffered, because she was irreplaceable in ways that I spent the next year trying to replace by being better than I was. I think of her every morning when I look in that cracked mirror. I try to ask myself what she would do. It's an imperfect guide because I'm not her and never will be, but it's the best one I have. Chapter 5. The Settlement in Year 10. Let me tell you about Millhaven as it stands today, because it matters for understanding what I'm trying to protect and why I will not let anything threaten it. We have 47 permanent residents. That number includes 12 children, which is our greatest treasure and our greatest responsibility. The oldest is 14, a girl named Rose who was 4 years old when the cascade happened and who has essentially no memories of the before world, which means she is in some ways the purest expression of what we're building, because she has no before to compare it to. She is the future in a way that those of us who remember the before cannot quite manage. We grow food. This is the central fact of everything. Alina laid the groundwork, and we've built on it over 10 years into something that actually functions. We have approximately 6 acres under cultivation, using techniques that draw from both modern sustainable agriculture and older, pre-industrial methods that require less in the way of chemical inputs and motorized equipment. We grow corn, beans, squash, potatoes, turnips, kale, and several varieties of hardy greens that have adapted better than most to the changed growing conditions. We keep 12 chickens and 4 goats. We have, as of last spring, 2 pigs, a development that caused genuine celebration in the settlement, because pigs are efficient, and pigs mean fat, and fat means winter survival. We have a water system. This took 3 years to build to a level I'm satisfied with. A creek runs through the eastern edge of the valley, fed from springs higher in the ridge springs that, as best we can determine, were not significantly contaminated by the initial fallout. We've built a filtration and collection system that would look laughably primitive to the engineers of the before world, but it works. The water is tested regularly using methods Alina documented before she died. We have a medical person. I use that term rather than doctor because our medical person, a 41-year-old woman named Dr. Priya Nair, was an orthopedic surgeon before the Cascade, meaning she has medical training that is extraordinarily valuable and also somewhat mismatched to our most common needs, which run toward infections, childbirth, dental pain, and the management of chronic conditions without the medications that used to manage them. Priya has spent 10 years learning what she didn't know, studying from the medical reference books we've collected, learning from a midwife named Greta who came to us in year 4, and who knew things about managing birth and infant illness that no surgery residency teaches. Together, they are remarkable. We have lost 2 people to medical causes in the last 3 years. That number is small enough that I allow myself some pride in it, and large enough that I never stop trying to improve what we can do. We have a school. This is the thing I'm proudest of, which surprises me sometimes, given that I came from a military background where I would not have predicted that education would become my most fiercely defended value. But there it is. We have a school that meets 5 days a week in the back of the feed store, the largest interior space we have, and where 7 of our adults on rotating schedules teach the 12 children everything we can manage: reading, writing, mathematics. History, the real history, not the cleaned-up version, but the full, complicated, sometimes ugly truth of how people have treated each other and what it costs. Science, how plants grow, how water moves, how the human body works, how to think carefully about a problem. I teach on Thursdays. I teach what I know. And I try to also teach what I've learned from getting things wrong because I think that's more valuable. We have a council. 7 people, including me, who meet twice a week to discuss settlement decisions. Major decisions go to a community vote. This was not how I operated in the military, and learning to operate this way has been one of the harder adjustments of my life, because there is a version of democratic decision-making that is slow and sometimes produces outcomes that are not optimal, and there are moments when I bite my tongue so hard it's a wonder I have one left. But I have come to believe, genuinely, in my bones, not as a policy position, that the process matters as much as the outcome, that people who have a voice in their own governance will protect what they've built in a way that people who are simply led will not, that the settlements that survive the next 50 years will be the ones that figured out how to make decisions together. I've come to believe a lot of things in the last 10 years that I did not believe before. This is one of the central facts of being alive, I think. You are always either becoming wiser or becoming more rigid, and the 2 paths look similar from the outside but lead to very different places. Chapter 6: The People. I want to tell you about some of the people of Millhaven, because a settlement is not a concept or a policy or a set of agricultural practices. It is people. Specific, irreplaceable, complicated, astonishing people. There is James Acaffer, who is 67 years old and was a high school football coach before the Cascade. James has a hip that didn't heal right after a fall in year 2, which means he can't do heavy physical work. And in the early days of Millhaven, before we understood his value, there were murmurings about resource allocation and people who could and couldn't pull their weight. I shut those murmurings down hard, and I would do it again. James is the reason our 12 children are not feral. He has a quality I can only describe as a gift for loving difficult people, children who are angry, children who are grieving things they can't name, children who act out the trauma of a world that ended around them, with a patience and a steadiness that I watch in awe. He is also the settlement's de facto oral historian. He sits with the children in the evenings and tells them about the before world, not the sanitized version, the real version with all its richness and its flaws. He tells them about music and movies and sports and highways and cities and the internet and all the extraordinary, wasteful, beautiful, stupid things that humans built in the before, so that those children understand what was lost and what might someday be built again. There is Greta Hoffman, who came to us in year 4 from somewhere in Georgia and who refused, for the first 8 months, to tell us anything about where she'd come from or what she'd experienced getting here. We didn't push. We had a policy from the early days of not requiring people's histories as the price of admission. What you do here matters. What you were before you got here is yours. Over time, she settled into us and we into her, and she eventually told her story to Priya first, and then to me, and it was, I won't share it because it's hers, one of the harder things I've heard. What I'll say is that she is one of the strongest people I know, and that her skill with birth and early childhood medicine has saved at least 3 lives I can count. There is Daniel Chu, who is 22 years old and was 12 when the cascade happened. He grew up in Millhaven, came here with his mother in year 1, and she died in year 2 of the flu, and he has been here since, growing up in the settlement. He is the first generation of Millhaven. He doesn't know quite how remarkable that is. He is practical and funny and occasionally exasperating, and he can fix almost anything mechanical with an ingenuity that constantly amazes me, and he represents, in a way that I think about more as I get older, the reason all of this matters. He didn't choose to be born into the end of the world. He didn't make any of the decisions that led to the cascade. He just woke up one day into a world that was trying to figure out what it was going to be. The least I can do is try to make sure that world is worth waking up into. There is Sarah Chen, who was a civil engineer and who has been invaluable in every structural project we've undertaken. She is methodical and precise, and occasionally drives me absolutely insane with her insistence on doing things correctly rather than quickly, and she is almost always right. She designed our water system. She oversaw the construction of the 2 additional shelter buildings we added in year 5. She is currently working on plans for a proper medical facility that Priya has been requesting for 3 years, and she has a notebook full of designs for a windmill that, if we can get the materials together, would give us a sustainable power source for the first time. There is Miguel Santos, who was a farmer before the cascade, actually a farmer, which made him one of the most valuable people we had from the beginning. He has forgotten more about growing food than most of us will ever learn, and he is the reason our yield has increased every year for the last 6 years. He is also, I should mention, a deeply spiritual man, and he leads a non-denominational gathering every Sunday morning at which anyone who wants to come can come, and he reads from whatever texts people have brought: the Bible, a collection of Buddhist sutras someone carried in their pack, a book of Rumi poems, a dog-eared copy of a Marcus Aurelius that someone found in an abandoned bookstore. I go most Sundays. I am not certain what I believe about God. 10 years after watching the world I know turn to ash. But I believe in what that gathering does for people, which is to say, it reminds them that they are not alone, and that the questions are worth sitting with even when the answers don't come, and that there is something larger than the daily work that is also worth giving attention to. These are the people of Millhaven, or some of them. They are not characters in a story to me. They are the whole point. Part 3: The Ghosts. Chapter 7: What I Carry. There is a ritual I have. Every year on the anniversary of the cascade, which I've calculated as best I can to the 2nd Tuesday of November, though I'm not confident in the precision, I take the day alone. I tell the settlement council I'm scouting the northern perimeter, which is partially true, and I walk up into the ridge above the valley, to a place where you can see a long stretch of the changed sky and the changed landscape, and the far edge of what used to be the next town over, which is now rubble and grass, and the slow reclamation of nature over what we built and broke. I sit there for the day. I bring my journal, which is a battered spiral notebook that I've been keeping since year 2, when I decided that the only way to carry the weight of what I'd done without being crushed by it was to put it down somewhere, to get it out of my head and onto paper, where it could be looked at rather than endlessly circled. I write about the decisions, the specific ones, the targeting meetings, the reports I signed, the times I argued for expansion of an operation and the times I argued against it and was overruled, and the times I was overruled and felt, briefly, relieved, because some part of me that I wasn't listening to then knew something was wrong, and I chose not to listen to it because it was inconvenient, because it threatened the certainty that I needed to function the way I was functioning. I write about the people I can't name, the people in the places we targeted who were not combatants, who were just people, who had names and families and fears and plans and breakfasts they were going to eat and things they were going to say to someone they loved. And then they didn't, because of decisions that I was part of making. I write about the weight of that, about how it doesn't get lighter exactly, but about how you learn to carry it differently, about how the first few years I carried it in my chest, like a physical thing, like swallowed stone, and it made me slow and gray and prone to silences that frightened some of the people around me, and about how I've learned gradually to carry it differently, not to set it down, because I don't think I get to set it down, but to integrate it, to let it be part of my walking, rather than a thing I'm walking despite. Accountability without self-destruction, that's the line I walk, some days more successfully than others. The self-destruction temptation is real. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important, and I think it's something that other people who have done harm, even well-intentioned harm, harm done in the name of something they believed in, understand, and feel alone in understanding. The temptation to decide that the weight of what you've done makes you unworthy of the life you're living. The temptation to stop trying, to step back from leadership and responsibility, to say, I don't get to be the one who builds something good because I was one of the ones who broke something good. Alina cured me of that in one of our early conversations. I had said something to that effect, some self-lacerating thing about my past and whether I deserved to be in the position I was in, and she looked at me with the particular impatience she reserved for nonsense and said, Adam, the world doesn't have the luxury of your guilt being more important than your usefulness. You feel bad. Good. Feel bad. And then come help me figure out why the North Field isn't draining properly. I think about that almost as often as I think about the anniversary rituals. Feel bad, and then come help. Chapter 8, The Things I Did. I've debated, over the years of keeping my journal, how specific to be about the decisions I was part of making. There is a version of accountability that is very specific and very public, and that names names and coordinates and casualty estimates. And there is a version that is more interior, more about the shape of the guilt than its precise dimensions. I've landed on the interior version mostly, for this reason. Specific details would require me to go through official records I don't have access to and verify things I can't verify 10 years later. And there is a kind of dishonesty in making very precise claims about harm that is actually more about making my accounting of myself feel thorough than about genuine reckoning. What I can tell you honestly, in general terms, is this. I was part of a unit that made targeting recommendations for strategic military operations. Those recommendations prioritized what we called infrastructure degradation, which is to say, we targeted systems that supported military operations, but those systems existed within civilian environments, and we knew the civilian casualty estimates, and we made a calculation that the military value exceeded the human cost, and we made that calculation more easily than we should have, and we made it repeatedly. And some of those calculations were wrong in ways that I didn't acknowledge at the time, because acknowledging them would have undermined the framework I needed to believe in to keep doing what I was doing. And then, in the final months before the cascade, our unit was part of a group making recommendations at a higher level. Recommendations about strategic deterrence posture, about what signals we were sending to adversaries, about, and this is the one that lives most heavily in my journal, about the calculus of first strike deterrence, about whether demonstrating willingness to escalate would cause the other side to stand down or to escalate in return. I argued for demonstrating willingness to escalate. Colonel Hatch argued for it. Several of us argued for it. We were confident it would work. We had models. We had historical precedent. We had a framework that was internally consistent and strategically coherent and completely, catastrophically wrong about how human beings actually behave when they feel cornered. The other side did not stand down. And so, I don't know if we fired first or they fired first. The sequence in those final hours became genuinely confused, and there were probably multiple actors making decisions simultaneously that fed into each other. What I know is that the posture we advocated for helped create the conditions in which firing first, for whichever side did it, became thinkable. And that is enough. That is plenty. That is the stone I carry, not as a punishment, as an instruction. Chapter 9. The night before Marcus arrived. Last night, the night before I spotted those three figures on the ridge, I couldn't sleep. This is not unusual. What was unusual was the particular shape of the sleeplessness. Normally, when sleep won't come, I get up and sit in the front of the store and look out the window at the settlement and think about the things that need doing. It's productive enough to not feel like wasted time. Last night, I sat in the dark and thought about Marcus. I've thought about him over the years, wondered where he ended up, whether the group he'd assembled at that farmhouse in Clarksville had survived the first winter, whether he'd built something, whether he'd changed. The wondering was, I realize now, a kind of wishful thinking. I was constructing a Marcus who had gone through the same crucible I had and come out the other side with similar conclusions. A Marcus who looked back at what we'd been and what the world we'd been building toward had produced and arrived at a similar place of grief and reckoning. But the thing about Marcus that I knew, even at 20, even at the beginning, the thing that was simultaneously his greatest strength and his most dangerous quality, was that he never second-guessed himself. Ever. Not once in all the years I knew him. He made a decision, he executed the decision, and if the decision was wrong, he found a reason why the wrongness was someone else's fault and moved on. It was extraordinary to watch in a special operations context. It made him almost supernaturally effective in the field. And it made him, I think, a particular kind of dangerous in a world without the structures that used to constrain that quality. I sat in the dark and thought about how I was going to greet him, what I was going to say, how I was going to handle the fact that he was my oldest friend in the world and that he represented things I had spent 10 years trying to move away from. I thought about the settlement asleep around me, the 47 people, Rose at 14, the two pigs, Priya's medical charts, Sarah's windmill drawings, James telling stories to children by firelight. And I thought, I know what I stand for. I have spent 10 years learning what I stand for, and I will not compromise it for friendship, for nostalgia, for the seductive comfort of being around people who knew me before I became the person I'm still working on becoming. I went asleep after a while, but not for long. Part 4. The Arrival. Chapter 10. Three Figures on the Ridge. The morning I spotted them, I was doing my usual dawn perimeter walk. This is a habit from the military that I've kept not out of paranoia, or not only out of paranoia, but because the dawn perimeter walk is also the time I think best. Something about the light and the quiet and the physical movement that quiets the parts of my brain that are always running some calculation or other. I saw them at the far end of the northern ridge, moving along the logging road. Three figures, moving in a file well-spaced, which is a trained habit. You spread out so that one engagement doesn't take all three of you at once. Carrying packs that sat right, the way people carry packs when carrying a pack is something they've done 10,000 times. Moving with a loose-limbed, ground-eating efficiency that I recognized before I could see faces. I went back to the feed store and got the binoculars. The magnification brought the faces into resolution one at a time. The figure in front, Marcus Webb, broader in the shoulders than I remembered, his hair cut close on the sides in a style that spoke of continued effort at grooming, a small thing that told me something about how he'd been living. A large pack, a rifle slung at a specific angle that told me, in the language of old habit, that he was comfortable with it. Behind him, Dak Reeves. I'd served with Dak for 2 years before he went to a different unit. Square-jawed, deliberately intimidating even from a distance. Even through binoculars at a quarter mile, there was something about the way he moved that was pointedly aggressive, the way some men walk when they want the world to know they are dangerous. Behind Dak, someone I didn't recognize, younger, mid-20s maybe, carrying himself with the bearing of someone who had learned it from the other two, which told me something about the dynamic. I put the binoculars down, sat on the rusted barrel, put my head in my hands. Got up. Went and found Sarah and Priya and Miguel, the 3 council members who would be awake at this hour. Told them we had incoming travelers. Told them I recognized 2 of them. Told them we'd welcome them as we welcomed everyone, with caution and openness in equal measure. I walked out to meet them at the gate. Chapter 11, The Handshake. The gate to Millhaven is not a dramatic thing. It is a cattle gate, the swinging kind, with a sign that Daniel made that reads, Millhaven Settlement. All are welcome. All are expected to contribute. It is unglamorous and I love it. I stood at the gate and waited. I could hear them coming before I could see them, the sound of boots on gravel and leaf litter, and then voices, Marcus's voice, in the particular cadence of someone giving someone else instructions. They came around the last bend in the road and stopped when they saw me. There was a moment, one of those long, loaded moments where nobody is quite sure what the moment is going to be. And then Marcus's face broke into that grin. The grin I'd known for 20 years, wide and easy and real. He came forward and grabbed my hand and pulled me into a backslapping embrace that was so familiar it ached. And for a moment, just a moment, it was Marcus and Adam from Cookville, 2 18-year-olds who'd signed up together and thought they knew everything. I knew it, he said, when he stepped back and looked at me. I knew if anyone would put something together, it'd be you. Good to see you, Marcus. This is Dak. I don't know if you remember. I remember Dak. I offered my hand to Dak, who shook it with the kind of firmness that is a communication. Something about his eyes. I filed it away. And this is Tyler, Marcus said, indicating the younger man. Tyler came with us out of the hills about 8 months ago. Good kid, solid. Tyler shook my hand with a quieter energy than Dak. He looked around at the settlement with eyes that were taking in everything, cataloging, but in a way that felt curious rather than calculating. I made a note to pay attention to Tyler. Come in, I said. There's food and water and we can sit down. Chapter 12, The First Meal. We fed them at the long table we'd built in the central gathering space, which is the front room of the old feed store, with the displays cleared out and replaced with tables made from wood that various members of the settlement had brought, found, or built over the years. It's not pretty, but it has a warmth to it that I'm fond of. Priya made an assessment of their physical condition without making it obvious she was doing so, a skill she's developed over years of knowing that some people are uncomfortable being assessed. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod that told me they were in reasonable shape. No obvious injuries, no signs of severe malnutrition, no signs of the specific illnesses that had been moving through some of the more southerly settlements we'd heard about through our loose network of travelers. James brought the children to eat at the same time, which was not strategic on his part. It was just lunch hour. But watching Marcus and Dak react to the children told me things. Marcus reacted the way you'd expect a decent person to react to children after a long period without encountering them, with something softening in his face, a reflexive warmth. He asked a couple of them their names. Rose, who is constitutionally unimpressed by strangers and likes to test them, asked him where he'd come from, and he gave her a vague answer, and she pressed him, she always presses, and he laughed, and the laugh was genuine. Dak looked at the children the way he looked at everything else. I don't want to overstate this. He was not threatening toward them. He was just unchanged by their presence, unaffected. A child is the most relentlessly humanizing thing in the world, and he was not humanized. I've met people like this before. It doesn't necessarily make them bad, but it's a data point. Tyler, the youngest of the 3, reacted to the children with what looked like something close to relief. He watched Rose interrogate Marcus with genuine amusement, and when a smaller boy, Peter, who is 7 and catastrophically curious about everything, climbed up next to him and demanded to know what was in his pack, Tyler very patiently opened the top flap and let Peter look in and explained each item. I watched that and thought, Tyler is not fully formed yet. He is still being shaped by whoever he's around. After the meal, I took Marcus aside. We walked to the back of the store, past the shelves where we keep our seed stock, and I showed him what we'd built, the organization of it, the careful labeling, the cross-reference system that a leaner had started and that we'd continued. It is, in the 10 years of Millhaven, the thing I am second, most proud of after the school. Marcus looked at it all with genuine admiration. You always were better at the long game than me, he said. You were better at the immediate problem. We were a good team. We were, I agreed. And then I said, because I needed to say it early, things work a certain way here, Marcus. I want you to understand that before we talk about anything else. He looked at me. The grin was still there, but different now, alert. Tell me, he said. We make decisions together. We have a council and we have community votes on major things. We have rules about how people are treated, all people, not just the people who have been here longest or who are strongest or who are most useful. We have rules about violence. And we have a culture here that I've spent 10 years building, and I will protect it. A pause, something moving through his expression that I watched carefully. Sounds like a very Adam thing to do, he said at last. And he smiled, and I couldn't fully read the smile. We're glad to have you, I said. All 3 of you, for as long as you want to stay, as long as you're willing to contribute and follow what we've built here. Understood, he said. I nodded. I believed him in the moment. I was also aware that Marcus had a particular gift for saying exactly what was needed in a given moment, which had always been one of his most effective qualities, and that saying what was needed was not always the same as meaning it. Chapter 13, the first week. The first week, everything was surface level fine. Marcus worked hard. He always worked hard. This was genuine, one of the things I'd always respected about him. He didn't ask what needed doing in the way some new arrivals do, looking for the easiest task. He assessed the situation and put his hands on the hardest problem in sight, which in the first week was the fence line on the western edge of our cultivation area, which had been damaged by a storm in September, and which we'd been patching inadequately since then. Marcus rebuilt it properly in 3 days, working long hours, and the fence line was better when he was done than it had been in years. Dak was assigned to field work, where Miguel put him to use on the heavy labor of late fall ground preparation. Miguel told me in our end-of-day check-in that Dak worked fine but didn't talk much and had a quality that Miguel found hard to name. He is present but not here, Miguel said. You understand. His body is working but his head is somewhere else. I understood. Tyler was assigned to help Priya and Greta because he'd mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he had some first aid training. It turned out to be more than some. He'd been a paramedic before the cascade. Priya spent 2 days carefully assessing what he knew and what he'd learned since and what he didn't know. And by the end of the week, she came to find me with an expression I'd come to recognize as her excited face, which is identical to her regular face, except for a very slight increase in the speed of her speech. He's going to be extraordinary, she said. If we can train him up properly, he's going to be the medical asset I've been asking for 4 years. This mattered. This mattered enormously, and I let myself feel the pure relief of it, that of the 3 people who'd arrived. At least one was going to be straightforwardly, uncomplicated, valuable. In the evenings, Marcus and I talked. The way we'd always talked, wide-ranging, jumping from subject to subject, the easy rhythm of 2 people who have 20 years of shorthand. He told me about the years since we'd parted ways on that farmhouse porch. The group he'd built in Clarksville had lasted 4 years before a bad winter had broken it apart, some people leaving, some dying, the delicate social machinery that holds people together cracking under the accumulated pressure of scarcity and loss. He'd spent the next several years moving, not aimlessly, but purposefully, building connections across a wide network of settlements and survivor groups across a broad area of the Mid-South. He knew things, more than I knew in terms of the broader regional picture. There were organized settlements that I hadn't heard of, some of them substantial. There were also groups that were not organized in the way I wanted to organize. Groups that had resolved the question of how to live in the afterworld by deciding that the strong take what they need and the weak make do with what's left. He'd encountered several of these. In some cases, he'd traded with them. This was the first thing that made me pause. Not overtly, I kept my expression easy, kept my response measured, but I noted it. The ones that operate on strength, I said carefully. Did you have problems with them? Problems? No. He looked at me. They operate on a different set of rules, that's all. You can work with people who operate on different rules as long as you understand the rules they're operating on. And you're comfortable trading with groups that take from weaker settlements. He met my eyes steadily. Adam, the before world is gone. The rules of the before world are gone. The sooner people accept that, the better their chances. I think we're building the rules of the next world, I said. And I think the rules we build now are the rules we'll be living with for generations. So I care a lot about what rules we build. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you always did think long. It's gotten me this far. Chapter 14, The Thing Marcus Said. The problem arrived in the form of a conversation that I was not supposed to hear. 11 days after their arrival, I was coming back from the seed storage shed. We keep the most critical seeds in a separate location, temperature as stable as we can manage, wrapped in the best protective packaging we have, and I came around the corner of the main building and stopped. Marcus and Dak were standing by the eastern fence, talking. Their voices were carrying in the still air. I couldn't see them. The corner of the building was between us, and they couldn't see me. By spring, Dak was saying. That's the window. Once the planting season starts, they'll be too busy and too tied to the location to push back effectively. By spring is fine, Marcus said. The relationships need time anyway. You can't just walk into a place like this and flip it. Has to feel organic. The council is the problem. The council is manageable. Chen and Santos are going to be stubborn, but they're not the decision maker. Adam is the decision maker. And Adam, a pause. Adam and I go back further than this place does. He'll come around. I stood very still around the corner of the building, in the cold November air, and listened to my oldest friend discuss how to gradually take over my settlement. I want to tell you that what I felt in that moment was anger, clean, righteous anger that is easy to act on. But it wasn't quite. It was something more complicated and older and more painful than anger. It was grief. The grief of finding out that the thing you'd hoped was true, that the person you'd known for 20 years had traveled some of the same road you'd traveled, had arrived at some of the same places, was not true, that he was the same. That all the years and all the rubble, and all the undeniable evidence of where the old way of thinking had led, had not moved him. I stood there for another minute, making sure I had heard what I had heard, and that I was not constructing it. Then I walked away quietly, back around to the front of the store, and I sat down on the steps, and I let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as I could afford to, which was about 5 minutes, and then I got up and went and found Sarah and Priya and Miguel. Part 5, The Reckoning. Chapter 15, The Council. We met that evening after dinner in Priya's examining room, which is the closest thing we have to a private space that can hold 5 people. Sarah, Priya, Miguel, and James. I told them what I'd heard. No dramatics, just the words, what Dak had said, what Marcus had said, the sequence of it. There was a long silence when I finished. How certain are you, Sarah said, about what you heard? Is there another interpretation? I've been asking myself that for 6 hours, I said. I can't find one that holds up. What do you want to do? Miguel asked. I want your thinking before I tell you what I want to do, I said. This is something a leaner taught me. When you've already formed an opinion, ask for others' thinking first, genuinely, because otherwise you're just looking for confirmation. Priya said, Tyler is not part of this. I'd stake a great deal on that. He doesn't even know what the other two are planning, I don't think. I nodded. This aligned with my own assessment. James said slowly, I've watched Marcus with the children. There's good in that man, Adam. I'm not saying that excuses this. I'm saying I believe there's good in him, and that might matter for how you handle it. There's good in him, I agreed. There's good in a lot of people who do harmful things. It doesn't change what the harmful thing is. What are the options? Sarah said in her engineer's mode, which I was grateful for. We laid them out. I won't detail all of them, but the range ran from asking them to leave immediately on one end to letting the situation play out until Marcus made a more overt move on the other, with various approaches in between involving confrontation, increased watchfulness, separating the three men, bringing the wider community into the decision. The option I kept coming back to was the direct one. I talked to Marcus, I said. Alone. I tell him what I heard. I give him the opportunity to tell me I'm wrong or to explain or to say what he actually intends. And I tell him clearly what will happen if his intentions are what I think they are. And if he's not honest with you, Priya asked. Then I'll know that too, and we'll handle it. Miguel said, and if it comes to asking them to leave, Dak, or Marcus, or all of them, what is the risk of that? What do three trained military men do when they're turned away from the one place they've seen in a long time that works? The room got quieter. That's the real question, Sarah said. Yes, I said, it is. We sat with it. The honest answer was, there was risk. Three trained, armed, angry men who'd been turned away from a settlement that had what they wanted. That was a scenario that could develop badly. I knew this. Everyone in that room knew this. But the alternative, I said, the alternative of letting them stay and waiting to see what they do, that's not zero risk either. That's risk distributed differently. Risk to the people we're responsible for, spread out over time, hidden, the kind you don't see coming. You've thought about this for 6 hours, James said, not a question. More than that. He nodded slowly. You know what a leaner would say. Yes, I said. She'd say, do the hard thing now rather than the harder thing later. Chapter 16, The Conversation. I found Marcus the next morning early, before the settlement was fully awake. He was already up, he always was, another habit we shared from the military, and sitting on the eastern fence, looking out toward the ridge. I sat next to him. We were quiet for a moment, the way old friends can be quiet together, except that this quiet had something underneath it now. Nice morning, he said. Marcus, I said. He looked at me, and I saw something in his face, not guilt exactly, but a recognition. He knew the tone. He'd heard it from me before, in the before world, in briefing rooms when something was about to be said that nobody wanted to say. What? I heard your conversation with Dak last night, by the eastern fence. I was coming back from the seed shed. He was still, perfectly militarily still, processing, deciding. How much did you hear? Enough. A very long pause. The sky was the pale, washed-out color that passes for dawn now, not the deep blue of before, but not without its own spare beauty either, which is something I've learned to appreciate. You make peace with the changed sky, or you spend your life mourning the old one. Adam, let me go first, I said, because I've had a day to think about this and I want to say it right. He nodded. He had the dignity, at least, not to pretend he hadn't said what I'd heard. I gave him credit for that. You're my oldest friend, I said. We've known each other for 20 years. We grew up in the same town, we signed up on the same day, we believed the same things for most of our lives. And some of what happened, not all of it, but some of it, is the product of things we believed, things we advocated for, things I advocated for. I have not forgotten that. I will not forget it. He was watching me carefully. I've spent 10 years trying to become someone different than the person I was then. Someone who understands that the way we used to think about power and force, and who gets to make decisions that thinking broke the world. Not by itself. It's not all our fault, but we were part of it. I was part of it. I carry that every day, and I will carry it every day for the rest of my life. I paused, looked at him directly. You're thinking about this differently. I hear it in how you talk about the settlements that operate by strength. I see it in how you and Dak move around this place, figuring out the angles. And yesterday morning, I heard you tell Dak that you were going to manage the council and that I was going to come around because we go back. He opened his mouth, and I held up a hand. I'm not done. He closed it. The thing I need you to understand, the most important thing, is that what you heard from me about what I'm building here and why I'm building it the way I'm building it, that was not a negotiating position. It was not the stated preference that I'll trade away for the right pressure or the right relationship. This place is built on actual things, on the idea that people have a voice, on the idea that we don't take from others, on the idea that the strong don't get to decide what the weak have to accept. I believe these things, not because they're convenient, not because they're the smart political play, because I have seen what the opposite looks like, Marcus. I helped make what the opposite looks like, and I will not make it again. Silence. The morning birds, the few there were, making their small noises in the distance. You've changed, Marcus said at last. Yes, I said, I have. I'm not sure I have. The honesty of that stopped me for a moment. Whatever I'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. Not immediately, not without deflection or justification. I know, I said. So what happens now? That depends on you, I said. If you can live here on the terms we've built, then you're welcome, and I mean that sincerely. There's good work to do, and I would be glad to do it with you. But the terms are not negotiable. The council is not a target. The community's voice is not an obstacle. And Dak, I paused. Dak is a problem I need you to speak to. Because if Dak can't operate within what we've built here, he can't stay. And if you're committed to whatever Dak is planning, then neither can I. Then neither can you. The words hung there. I watched him absorb them, the full, real weight of them. You'd actually do that, he said. Turn away your oldest friend. I'd give my oldest friend every opportunity to be someone who can stay, I said. I'd be glad, genuinely, honestly glad if my oldest friend could be that person. But I won't compromise what I've built for 47 people because of what we had 20 years ago. I love you, Marcus. But I love them too. And I owe them more in some ways because they didn't choose me, they trusted me. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I stopped waiting for him to speak and just sat with him in the early morning, looking out at the changed ridge, the pale sky, the world that we had both, in our different ways, helped to make. I need to think, he said. I know, I said. Take the time you need, but not too long. Chapter 17, Dak. I talked to Dak that afternoon. This was, in some ways, the harder conversation. Marcus and I had 20 years of history and genuine affection to work with. Dak and I had 2 years of professional acquaintance and no warmth. I found him in the barn, where he'd been doing maintenance on some of the hand tools, sharpening blades, tightening handles. He was good with his hands in a practical way. I watched him work for a moment before he heard me and turned. Carver, he said. Reeves, I said. And then, because I believed in directness, I overheard your conversation with Marcus yesterday evening. He didn't move, didn't change expression, just watched me. I'm not going to play games about what I heard, I said. I know what you're thinking about doing or trying to do, and I'm here to tell you clearly. It won't work, it isn't welcome, and if you continue down that path, you'll need to leave. Leave, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Leave, yes. I kept my voice even. I'm not threatening you with anything other than that. You leave, you take your pack and your rifle and you go wherever you decide to go. We send you with food and water same as we'd do for anyone, but you go. And if I don't want to go, then you make a choice about how badly you want to stay, and whether you're willing to make that choice violently, which would be the worst decision you could make. I said it quietly, without heat. You're a trained, experienced soldier. So am I. I know the ground here, and I know every person in this settlement, and they know me. You don't want that fight, Dak. Not because you'd lose, maybe you wouldn't, I don't know, but because there's no version of that fight that gives you what you think you want. A place you've taken by force isn't a community. It's a hostage situation, and it falls apart. He was still watching me, something working in his expression. "Why are you telling me all this?" he said, "instead of just kicking us out?" "Because you've contributed this last week and a half. Because Tyler is a genuinely good person who I don't want to punish for your plans. Because Marcus is someone I care about and I'm giving him the chance to make a different choice." I paused. "And because I've seen what happens when you treat people as threats without giving them the opportunity to be something else. I don't do that anymore." A long silence. "You're serious," he said. "Not a question, just an observation." "Completely." He looked down at the tool in his hands, a hatchet edge up newly sharpened. He set it carefully on the workbench. "I'll think about what you said," he said. "That's all I'm asking." Chapter 18, Tyler's Question. Tyler found me that evening, while I was doing the last walk of the day, checking the gate, the perimeter, the small things that need checking. "Can I walk with you?" he asked. "Sure." We walked for a while without speaking. The evening was cold and still, with the smell of the wood fires from the settlement behind us and the open dark of the ridge ahead. Stars were beginning to appear. The sky had cleared enough tonight, which happens sometimes, and the stars were astonishing when the sky cleared because there was no artificial light to compete with them. "I don't know everything they were planning," Tyler said. "I want you to know that." "I figured," I said. "I've been with them 8 months. They saved my life, I mean that literally. I was in bad shape when they found me and they pulled me out of it, and I owe them something for that." "You do," I agreed. "But I've been uncomfortable for a while, with some of the things," he stopped, started again. "With the way Dak talks about places and people, like they're resources to be managed." "Yeah," I said. "Is that what you're dealing with?" "Basically." He was quiet for a while, walking, then, "What do? I owe them, but I don't want to be part of something that—" He stopped again, frustrated. "Tyler," I said, "you don't owe anyone your conscience. You can be grateful to them for saving your life and still refuse to do things that are wrong. Those two things aren't in conflict." "That's easy to say." "It's also true," I said. "Believe me, I know something about this. About feeling like your loyalty to people is in conflict with what you know is right." He looked at me sideways. "What did you do before all this?" I'd answered this question hundreds of times since building Millhaven, always truthfully. But the truth landed differently depending on when in a conversation it arrived. And tonight, walking in the cold dark with this young man who was trying to figure out his conscience, I decided the full truth was worth giving. I told him, not everything, not the hours of detail that live in my journal, but the shape of it, the military career, the unit, the targeting decisions, the advocacy for escalation, the cascade, and my part in the conditions that led to it. He listened without interrupting. By the time I'd finished, we'd walked most of the perimeter and were coming back around toward the gate. "That's," he started. "A lot," I supplied. I was going to say honest. "That too." "Do people here know? Everyone in the settlement?" "The council knows. Some others. I don't hide it when it comes up. And it comes up more than you'd think, because part of my job here is to explain why we do things the way we do, and to explain that, I have to explain what I learned and how I learned it." He was quiet for another moment. "And you just live with it," he said. "You just carry that and keep going." What's the alternative? I said gently. Stop going. That doesn't bring anyone back, doesn't undo anything. It just makes the number of people doing useful work smaller by one. I paused. You carry it. You let it teach you. You try to make every day a partial answer to the question it asks. He nodded slowly. I want to stay, he said. Here, if you'll have me, not with them necessarily. I want to stay and learn from Priya and do useful work, and he stopped. Can I do that without being? Tyler, I said, you are welcome here completely on your own terms. Your history with Marcus and Dak doesn't define what you are here. What you do here does. He exhaled, a long shaky exhale like something releasing. Okay, he said, okay, thank you. Part 6, The Choice. Chapter 19, Marcus's Answer. 3 days. Marcus was quiet for 3 days. He worked, he always worked, but without the social ease of the first week. He was thinking. I could see it in him, the particular quality of his silence, and I gave him the space for it because I knew that whatever he came out of that silence with, it would be genuine. On the 3rd evening, he came to find me. I was in the school space, grading, which is not quite the right word, but there isn't a better one, the writing the children had done that week. Rose had written an essay about what she would want to know about the before world if she could know one thing. She'd written, I would want to know if the people who made the world that way knew what they were doing to everyone who would come after them, and if they did, what they told themselves to make it okay. I had set it down and stared at the wall for a while before picking it up again. Marcus came in and sat across the table from me. I've been thinking about what you said, he began. I figured. You were right about some of it, he said. Not about everything, but about some of it. He looked at his hands. The thing about, he stopped, tried again. I never really sat with it. What happened? The cascade, I kept moving, kept building. I told myself that's what you do, you keep going, you don't look back, you deal with what's in front of you. I know that mode, I said. And what you described, sitting with it and carrying it, and he shook his head. That sounds like hell, Adam. It's not easy, I said, but the alternative isn't not carrying it. The alternative is carrying it without knowing you're carrying it, and that makes it heavier and it comes out in ways you don't control. He was quiet. Dak is not going to change, he said. I need you to know that, whatever I decide. He's further down that road than I am. He's not coming back from it. I know. He'll leave if I tell him to. He won't like it, but he'll go. He respects enough of the old chain of command. He paused. It's not respect exactly. It's that taking you on would cost him something and he'd rather conserve the resource. But he'll go. And Tyler? Tyler, Marcus looked out the window. Tyler was never part of what we were planning. He's a good kid. He deserves better than what we were using him for, which was basically a buffer, someone who made us look less threatening. I'm not proud of that. The honesty of that again. It kept catching me off guard. Whatever else Marcus was, he was not a man who lied to himself easily, at least not when he was genuinely confronted. And you, I said. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I didn't try to fill the silence. I want to try, he said. I want to try to be what you're describing, the version of this you've built here. I don't know if I can. I'm more Dak than I want to be, and I know that, but I don't want to be Dak all the way down. Okay, I said. Is that enough? I want to try. From anyone else, I'd say trying is exactly enough, I said carefully. With you, Marcus, with you I'm going to ask for something more specific because we have 20 years of friendship and I don't want that friendship to become a reason I let us both off the hook. I'm going to ask you to mean it, not just in this conversation, in the decisions you make here, in how you talk about the other settlements, in whether you can genuinely accept that you don't get to run this place. That last one, he said, that's the hard one. I know it is, I said. It's hard for me too, and I've been practicing it for 10 years. Something shifted in his face. Not softened, Marcus Webb did not soften exactly, but opened. a crack in the certainty. "Tell me about Alina," he said. "You've mentioned her. Tell me what she taught you." And so I did. We sat in the school room while the settlement settled into the evening quiet around us, and I told him about Alina Marsh and her absolute impatience with nonsense and her feel bad, then come help, and her way of asking rather than telling, and her slow, patient, brilliant work of building a community out of the wreckage of one of the worst situations imaginable. And Marcus listened, really listened, which was something I'd seen him do rarely in 20 years. He listened the way a person listens when they're not preparing their response, just absorbing what's being said. When I was done, he said, "She sounds like she was worth knowing." "The most worth knowing," I said. Chapter 20, The Departure. Dak left 2 days later. Marcus had spoken to him. I don't know what passed between them privately, and I didn't ask. What I know is that Dak came to find me the morning of his departure, pack on his back, rifle at its accustomed angle. He didn't offer his hand. We stood in the cold morning air and looked at each other. "You run a tight ship," he said. "Not complimentary, not critical, just an observation." "We try," I said. "The network to the south and east is going to find you eventually," he said. "Groups like the ones Marcus trades with. You're going to have to deal with that." "I know," I said. "Your way of dealing with things," he shook his head. "I don't think it's going to be enough." "I think you're wrong about that," I said, "but I appreciate the warning." Something moved in his face, not softening, more like acknowledgement, the recognition of one soldier by another. "You were always one of the good ones," he said, "even when I thought you were being naive." "I thought you were one of the best," I said, and meant it. "I still think you could be." He looked at me, a long look. Then he turned and walked through the gate, down the gravel path, toward the road. I watched him until he was out of sight around the first bend. I don't know what Dak did after that. I hope, against the weight of what I know about him, that he found something worth building. I pray, in the loose non-denominational way that Miguel has taught me, that somewhere in him is the version that could become that. But I held the gate open and I watched him go, and I did not call him back, because there was nothing more I could offer that he was willing to take. Some people you can reach. Some people you can't. The hard wisdom is learning to know the difference before the effort of reaching tears something that can't be repaired. Part 7, The Work Continues. Chapter 21, Winter. The settlement's 5th winter under my watch, the 10th overall. There is a particular quality to the work of surviving a winter now that I think about, that the before world never required of its inhabitants. In the before world, winter was a season. You put on a coat. You turned up the thermostat. You watched it snow out the window and felt, if you were inclined toward it, a kind of romance about the cold and the quiet and the world going still. Here, winter is a problem to be solved. Solved again every year because the conditions are never quite the same, because our resources change year to year, because the people change, new arrivals, losses, illnesses that shift the calculus. Solving winter requires that you have stacked enough firewood in the right locations, that you have preserved enough food and stored it where it won't freeze, that you have insulated the living spaces adequately, that you have a plan for the medical needs that always intensify in cold months, and that you have attended to the psychological needs of people who will be confined to close quarters for months, which are real and urgent needs, even if they don't show up on a supply list. I am good at the practical parts of winter now. It took 3 years to get there, to develop the judgment for how much wood, how much food, what the warning signs are for what kinds of problems. The psychological parts I'm still learning. Miguel is better at it than I am. James is brilliant at it. I contribute what I can and I try to stay aware of my own limitations and fill them with other people's strengths, which is, I think, the actual job of leadership stripped of all its pretensions. Marcus contributed to the winter preparations in ways that confirmed what he'd said at the school table, that he wanted to try. He was not, in that first month, a changed man. He was a man at the beginning of trying to change, which is a different and harder thing. He pushed back occasionally on decisions he didn't agree with, and twice he pushed in ways that were closer to the old Marcus than the new, and both times I had direct conversations about it that were uncomfortable and necessary. The first time, it was about a family, a mother and her 2 children, who arrived mid-November from the south. They were in poor condition, malnourished and cold, and had clearly been through something that none of them were ready to talk about. Standard protocol: bring them in, feed them, let Priya assess their health, give them a few days before asking questions about history and intentions. Marcus argued in council that we should ask the questions first, that we didn't have the resources to take in people without knowing who they were and where they'd come from, that the scarcity of winter wasn't the time for open-door policies. "We have enough food," Sarah said flatly. "This year," Marcus said. "What about next year if we keep taking people in?" "The mother's name is Caroline," I said. "Her children are 4 and 6. Her 4-year-old has a respiratory infection that Priya needs to treat in the next 48 hours or it's going to become pneumonia. We don't ask questions first. We help first." He looked at me, looked around the council. "Fine," he said. And then, and this was the part I held on to as evidence that the trying was genuine, he went and helped Greta carry the family's things to the shelter space we'd prepared for them, and he sat with the 4-year-old for an hour while Priya treated her, making faces and telling a story about a bear and a rabbit that he apparently made up on the spot, and the 4-year-old laughed, and I heard it from the other room. The second incident was harder. A traveler came through, a man on his own who'd been part of one of the southern groups that Dak had mentioned, one of the strength-based operations. He'd left. Why exactly wasn't clear, and the ambiguity was itself a concern. Marcus was openly suspicious, argued that the risk was too high and that we should send him on his way. He wasn't entirely wrong about the risk. It was a real risk, but I had looked at the man across the table, thin, scared in a way that he was working hard to cover, with something in his eyes that I recognized as a person trying to decide if they deserved better than what they'd been living in, and I had made a call. He stayed. He's been here 2 months now. His name is Samuel. He works hard and he doesn't make trouble, and 3 weeks ago he helped James repair the roof of the school space in a way that saved us a significant amount of material. He is not the same person in week 8 that he was in week 1. People change when they're given conditions that allow for change. This is one of the things I know for certain. Marcus was not happy about Samuel for the first few weeks. He watched him with an attention that I understood and monitored. I talked to Marcus about it twice. The second time, Marcus said something that surprised me. "How do you decide," he said, "when to trust and when not to?" "Slowly," I said, "carefully, with a lot of attention to what people do, not just what they say." "And when you get it wrong?" "Then I get it wrong," I said, "and I deal with the consequences and I try to learn. But I'd rather get it wrong in the direction of trust than in the direction of fear. Fear is not the culture I want to build here. Trust, earned, careful trust is." He thought about that for a long time. "My whole life," he said eventually, "I operated on the assumption that the world was basically adversarial, that people were, at bottom, in competition with each other, that the ones who understood that and prepared for it were the ones who survived. And he stopped, looked out at the settlement. Samuel was across the way working on something with Daniel. They were laughing at something. I don't know if I was wrong or if this is just a pocket, an exception." "Maybe it's both," I said. "Maybe the world is adversarial in some places, and in other places, in the places where enough people choose otherwise, it's something else. And maybe the point is to be one of the places where people choose otherwise, and to make that choice as many times as it needs to be made." He thought about that for a long time too. Chapter 22. What the Children Know. Rose asked me, during a Thursday lesson, how the war started. I had been expecting this question. Rose has been working toward it for several months, circling it, approaching it obliquely, asking adjacent questions that she knows connect to the central one. She is 14, and she is the sharpest person I've ever met, and I have been preparing for this conversation with the same seriousness I used to prepare for mission briefings. The other children were there, 6 of them in the lesson that day, ranging from Rose at 14 down to Peter at 7. I looked at them for a moment, this small collection of young people who had inherited a world they hadn't made, and I made a decision. I told them the truth. Not all of it, not the specific operational details that exist in my journal and that are for adult processing, but the shape of it, the way that people can believe they're doing the right thing and still do catastrophic harm, the way that certainty, the absolute, unchallengeable certainty that you know what's right, and that the ends justify the means, can become one of the most dangerous things in the world. The way that the story of how the war started is not the story of monsters who wanted destruction, but of human beings who wanted victory and who confused victory with safety, and who were so committed to their certainty that they couldn't stop the machine they'd built even when it became clear the machine was going to destroy the thing they were trying to protect. I told them that I was part of it, that I made decisions that contributed to what happened. I said it plainly, without melodrama, without self-flagellation, because the children don't need to see me punish myself. They need to see someone who did harm, acknowledges it, and kept living and kept trying to do good. They need to see that it's possible. Rose listened to all of it with her characteristic stillness. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So the lesson is that being certain you're right is more dangerous than admitting you might be wrong." "That's one way to put it," I said. "What's your way?" I thought about it. My way is, when you have the most power to cause harm is exactly when you need to be the most careful, the most humble, the most open to being wrong. Because the consequences of being wrong at that scale are they don't stay inside the decision. They spread. She nodded, processing. "Does it help," she asked, "knowing you're trying to fix it?" I looked at her, 14 years old, the future in a 14-year-old's frame, watching me carefully. "Fixing it isn't really the word," I said. "You can't fix it. What happened happened and it can't be undone. But you can make something out of the aftermath. You can insist that what comes next is better. You can take everything you learned from the thing that went wrong and pour it into the thing you're building so that the thing you're building is shaped by those lessons." I paused. "That's what this place is. That's what I'm trying to make this place." Rose nodded again. Then, with the particular economy of 14-year-olds who have said everything they need to say, "Okay, can we do math now?" And we did math. Chapter 23, Spring. Spring in year 10 is different from spring in year 1. I don't mean that romantically. I mean it practically. In year 1, spring was a raw emergency, the desperate planting of seeds by people who were not yet sure what they were doing, in soil whose condition was uncertain, with the grim awareness that what grew or failed to grow between March and October would determine who was alive come winter. This spring feels like something else. I don't have a word for it exactly. Not ease, the work is still hard and the margins are still thin, and there are still decisions every day that could go wrong. But something like competence. The competence of people who have learned how to do a thing over 10 years and who do it now with the particular efficiency of practice. Miguel knows this soil the way he knows his own hands. Sarah's water system flows cleanly and reliably. Priya and Tyler have a rhythm in the medical space. That means the settlement is healthier entering this winter than it has ever been. And new things, small new things that feel enormous when you've been waiting for them. The windmill is started. Sarah has the foundation laid and the first of the support structures erected. It is an astonishing object in the landscape, this handmade, slightly ungainly structure rising up from the south edge of the settlement, nothing like the commercial wind turbines of the before world, but recognizable as a cousin. Daniel made most of the components. He has been spending evenings for 3 months in his workshop, fabricating pieces with a focus that reminds me, in the best way, of the intensity he brings to every problem he decides is worth solving. The windmill will not, when complete, power anything like what we used to run on electricity. It will charge a bank of batteries. Those batteries will run some lights. Those lights will extend the usable hours of the school day in winter, which alone makes it worth 3 months of Daniel's evenings. Marcus is building something. I say this with the weight of knowing what the phrase means to me now, after a year of watching him in the settlement. He is building slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks, a different version of himself. He still argues in council. He still gets impatient with process. He still has the instinct to default to force when things get difficult. But he catches himself more than he used to. He asks more than he used to. And he has developed, of all things, a friendship with James, which I watched develop with a confused wonder and have come to understand as making complete sense. James is the gentlest possible pressure, and Marcus needed gentle pressure more than any other kind. They sit together in the evenings, James telling his stories, Marcus listening, sometimes contributing. Marcus has a lot of stories from the before world, from deployments and operations, from years of living on the edge of things, and some of them are extraordinary, told in James's company, stripped of the context that used to make them sound like war stories and revealing themselves as what they actually are: human stories. People trying to survive. People making decisions under pressure. People being kind when they had every reason not to be, and being terrible when they should have known better. The children love hearing him. This is the part that gets me most. When Marcus tells stories to the children at James's fireside gathering, he tells them well, with the theatrical attention of a natural storyteller, with the detail of someone who actually observed what he's describing rather than summarizing it. And the children listen with the same hunger they bring to everything, because they are children who understand. In a way that children before the cascade perhaps did not have cause to understand, that stories are how we understand who we are and who we want to be. Chapter 24, Caroline's Children. I want to tell you about the day that mattered most this spring, which was not a day of dramatic events. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in its weather and its tasks, except for this one thing. Caroline's 4-year-old, her name is Lily, had recovered fully from the respiratory infection that Priya and Tyler had treated in November. She was one of those children who, once well, become almost aggressively alive. Running when walking would serve just as well, asking questions at a rate that outpaces everyone's ability to answer, attaching herself to whoever she finds most interesting with a completeness that is either charming or overwhelming depending on your resources at the moment. She had attached herself, in the month since her family's arrival, to Marcus. I don't know when it started, gradually as these things do. He has a way with her that I find genuinely moving, which is a word I would not have used about Marcus 5 years ago. He doesn't talk down to her. He treats her questions, even the ones that make no logical sense, which is most of them, as worthy of consideration. He has taken to carrying a small carved wooden fox in his pocket, which he made in the first weeks of winter from a scrap piece of wood, and which Lily calls the fox, with the gravity of a significant friendship. On this particular Tuesday in spring, I was coming back from the North Perimeter check, and I came around the corner of the storage shed and I saw them in the garden area. Marcus was sitting on an upturned crate, and Lily was next to him, and they were looking at something in the soil. Not working, just looking. Lily was pointing at something and saying something I couldn't hear, and Marcus was leaning forward and looking at whatever she was pointing at with complete attention, the kind of complete attention that is genuinely rare in adults. I stopped. I did not go around the corner immediately. I watched Marcus Webb, former Special Operations soldier, man who had walked toward my settlement 10 months ago with the intention of gradually taking it over, man who had spent his adult life operating on the certainty that the world was adversarial and power was its primary currency. Watch a 4-year-old point at a worm in the soil. And I watched something in his face. Not transformation. Transformation is a dramatic word for something that is mostly much quieter and slower. But an opening. The same crack I'd seen at the school table, wider now. The genuine thing that I had believed was in him, which was why I hadn't turned him away, visible and real and present. He said something to Lily. She looked at him and laughed, the full-body laugh of 4-year-olds who find something genuinely hilarious, and he laughed too, and it was real. I went back the way I'd come and gave them another few minutes before making enough noise that my approach was obvious. When I came around the corner, Lily launched herself at me with the complete confidence that I would catch her, which I did, and she informed me that there was a very large worm in the garden, and it was Marcus' friend now, and his name was Gerald. "That's a fine name for a worm," I said. Marcus looked at me, something in his eyes that was asking a question he wasn't going to put into words. "Nice morning," I said. "Yeah," he said, "pretty nice." Part 8, What We Build. Chapter 25, The Network. We are not alone. This is the thing I want to make clear, because the story of Millhaven is not actually the story of a single settlement. It is part of a larger story that I can see the edges of, even if the full shape is beyond what any one person can see. There are other settlements. Some I know about through direct contact, travelers who pass through and bring news, trading relationships we've established with 3 or 4 communities within a day's walk. Some I know about secondhand, through those travelers. And some I know about through Marcus, who came to us with a knowledge of the broader network that has turned out to be one of his most significant contributions. He didn't know it at the time, or maybe he did, and it was part of the calculation. I'll never quite be certain. But the knowledge he carried of where settlements existed and what they needed and what they had to trade has been, practically speaking, enormously valuable. We've established a supply relationship with a community to the east that has metalworking capacity we lack, exchanging preserved food for tools. We've established a loose communication system with 2 communities to the south that functions as an early warning network. If one of us sees a potentially dangerous group moving through the area, we find ways to alert the others. This is not the internet. This is not the postal service. This is 4 people who function as couriers, walking routes between settlements on a schedule that takes weather and safety into account, carrying physical messages and small trade goods, and most importantly, information. Information about what's working. Information about what medical treatments have been effective or ineffective. Information about which agricultural techniques are producing results in the changed soil. Information about what we're learning collectively about how to rebuild. The network is fragile. It depends on trust between communities that are still figuring out whether to trust each other, and on the continued willingness of people to devote the significant effort required to maintain it. It has nearly broken down twice, for reasons that were both times about resource competition and fear. Both times it was patient, sustained diplomatic effort, mostly by Sarah, who turns out to be the most naturally talented diplomat among us, that kept it from collapsing. But it exists. It is real. And in the last 2 years, I have begun to feel the first stirrings of something that I am cautious about nomming, because nomming things before they're solid is how you jinx them. But that feels, if I squint at it carefully, like the beginning of something larger than a survival network. Like the beginning of community in the older, bigger sense. Community not as people who happen to be surviving in the same location, but as people who have decided to be accountable to each other across distances, to share what they know and what they have, to treat a problem in a settlement 10 miles away as a problem worth addressing, because the world we're building together is the world we're all going to live in. I think about what that could become. I try not to think too far ahead, because too far ahead is a way of leaving the present, and the present is where the work is. But I let myself think just far enough to keep going on the days when keeping going is hard. Chapter 26, The Anniversary. It is November again, the second Tuesday. I have done my walk up the ridge. sat with my journal in the thin, pale light that falls on the changed landscape, written what I needed to write, carried what I carry. This year, coming back down the ridge, I stopped at the halfway point, where there's a boulder that I've sat on several times over the years, and I looked out at the valley. I could see Millhaven from here. The buildings, the feed store, the two newer shelters, the barn, the small cluster of individual structures that people have built or moved into over the years, each one a small piece of evidence that someone decided this was a place worth putting down roots. I could see smoke from the cook fires, which means people are already up and working. I could see Sarah's windmill, nearly complete now, its frame rising above the settlement with a clarity that should be awkward, a handmade thing, slightly irregular, built from necessity rather than precision manufacturing, but is instead somehow the most right-looking thing in the landscape. Something built by human hands that knows what it's for. I thought as I sat there about the 28-year-old version of myself, the one who wore certainty like armor, who knew who the enemy was and what had to be done, and why the rules he operated within were justified by the outcomes they were designed to achieve. I thought about how completely that person would have failed at the work of the last 10 years, not because he lacked skill or intelligence or dedication, but because the particular kind of dedication he had, the kind that is fueled by certainty rather than by genuine care, by the desire to win rather than the desire to make things better, that kind breaks down in the presence of actual human beings with actual needs that don't conform to strategic frameworks. I thought about Alina and what she taught me about asking rather than telling, about James and what he knows about loving difficult people into their better selves, about Priya, who never lost a patient without making herself understand exactly what had gone wrong and exactly what she would do differently next time, and who applies that same rigor to everything, about Miguel, who plants things in damaged soil and waits with a patience that has no floor, and they grow, about Sarah, who designs structures that will outlast her by centuries if the people who come after us maintain them, about Daniel, who was 12 when the world ended, and who has grown up to be one of the most capable and optimistic and stubbornly alive people I've ever encountered, about Rose, who is 14 and who wants to know if the people who broke things knew what they were doing, and what they told themselves to make it okay. The honest answer to Rose's question, the one I gave her and the one I'd give again, is that most of them did not know what they were doing. Not fully. Not the way the outcome would become clear. They knew they were taking risks. They told themselves the risks were acceptable, that the calculations worked out, that the strength of their conviction was evidence of the rightness of their cause. What they did not do, what I did not do, was stay humble in the face of doubt. What we did not do was slow down when the situation demanded slowness. What we did not do was listen to the people who were telling us, in voices that were quieter than the urgency of the moment but just as real, that there was another way, that the path we were on had consequences we weren't accounting for. I know that now. It doesn't undo anything, it shapes everything. I got up from the boulder and walked back down the ridge toward Millhaven, toward the cook fires and the windmill and the children, and the work that is never done and never meaningless. Chapter 27, Millhaven in Spring, Year 11. Let me tell you where we stand. 1 year passed when I spotted 3 figures on the ridge. 10.5 years passed when the world remade itself in fire and ash. 53 people. We've added 6 since last fall. Caroline's family, Samuel, a pair of siblings who came in February from the north and who are still finding their feet but who brought skills in woodworking that we needed badly. Tyler. And 1 birth, which is the most significant addition of all, a boy born in January to a couple who have been part of Millhaven since year 3, who was born healthy and loud and thoroughly inconvenienced by the experience, and who has been named, at his parents' request, after Alina, modified slightly. Eli. Eli is 4 months old. He has never known a world other than this one. He will grow up speaking the language of the settlement. the practical language of people who know how things work because they've built them, who know where food comes from because they've grown it, who know that decisions are made together because they've sat in the room when the decisions were made. He will grow up knowing that the strong do not simply take what they want from the weak, not because it's against the rules, but because the world he grows up in is one where that rule is lived, every day, in 1,000 small choices. He will grow up knowing Marcus, who is, 10 years after the Cascade and 1 year after arriving in Millhaven with a plan to take it over, one of the more useful members of the settlement, which is a sentence I could not have predicted and still find remarkable. He is the one who has taken on the coordination of our network relationships, the trading, the communication, the careful diplomatic work of building trust with communities that are not like us and some of which might someday become more like us if the example holds. He is good at it, better than I would have expected. He brings to it the same quality he brought to military operations, the ability to see the whole picture, to think several moves ahead, stripped, gradually and imperfectly, of the adversarial framework that used to be the only one he applied. He still argues in council. This is both a frustration and, I've come to understand, a feature. He argues from a perspective that is different from mine and different from Sarah's and different from Miguel's, and the argument, when conducted in good faith, which it mostly is now, makes the decisions better. He asks the questions nobody else wants to ask. He pushes back on the optimism that can become its own kind of naivety. He keeps us from being too comfortable with our assumptions. He and James still sit together in the evenings. The stories continue. Lily, Caroline's daughter, who is now 5 and who has made Gerald the worm into something of a local legend, though whether it's the same worm is anyone's guess, is in the school full-time now. She calls Marcus by his first name and has decided, without anyone asking her opinion, that he is in some capacity her responsibility, which means she reminds him to eat, reports to James on his emotional state, and brings him things she has found, feathers, interestingly shaped stones. Once a remarkable piece of glass worn smooth by time into something almost jewel-like, with the confidence of someone who knows her gifts will be appreciated. He always appreciates them. The windmill is complete. We generated our first stored electricity 17 days ago, and the lights in the school space burned for 4 hours that evening, and every person in the settlement who could be there came to see it. I stood in the back and watched their faces in the electric light, faces that ranged in age from Eli in his mother's arms to James at 68, lit by something that would have been completely unremarkable in the before world, and that in this world was so extraordinary that several people were crying and nobody said anything about it, because we all understood. Daniel stood next to me. He is 23 now. He will be the one who figures out how to do more, how to build on this, to expand it, to understand the principles deeply enough to teach them. He is the next generation of this work, and I am old enough now, which is to say, old enough to feel the particular responsibility of making sure that what I know doesn't die with me, that I am teaching as fast as I'm learning. Chapter 28, The Letter I'll Never Send. In my journal, in the back section that I keep for things that are for my eyes only, I have something I wrote last year and that I have not shown anyone. A letter, not to any living person, a letter to the people who were in the places we targeted, to the people who are not here because of decisions I was part of making. I write it differently every anniversary. This year's version is the one I'll share, because this year's version is the one I feel closest to the truth. To you, wherever you are, whoever you were, whoever you would have been. I don't know your names. This is one of the most honest things I can say about my situation. I don't know your names, and the people who made the decisions I was part of making did not know your names either, and that not knowing was part of how the decisions were made. You were numbers in estimates, acceptable losses in calculations. The math was done on you, and for you without you, and it was the math that broke the world. I cannot fix this. I know that. I carry it anyway, not as punishment but as instruction. as the most permanent lesson about what it costs when people with power decide that certain lives are acceptable to lose in service of an outcome they believe in. I try to build something here that is the opposite of that calculation. A place where numbers are names, and names have faces, and faces have stories, and stories matter before decisions are made, not after. It isn't enough. I know it isn't enough, but it is what I have to offer, and I offer it completely every day that I am alive to offer it. The children here will not make the decisions that were made, not because they're better than we were, they're human beings, with all the human capacity for self-deception and certainty, and the desire to win at any cost, but because they are growing up in a world that is teaching them what it costs. And I will keep teaching it for as long as I have to teach it, as clearly and honestly as I can. That is my answer. That is all I have. I hope it is something. Epilogue: the morning. This morning, like most mornings, I got up before the settlement stirred. I stood at the cracked mirror above the utility sink and looked at the man looking back at me. 38 years old. Lines in a face that has earned them the hardest possible way. Eyes that are still not the eyes of the 28-year-old who was certain about everything, and are not the eyes of the 32-year-old who walked out of a mountain into a broken world carrying the stone of what he'd done, and are not quite the eyes of any version of me I've been before. They're the eyes of a person who is still becoming, who has not finished becoming. I think about this often, the difference between a person who is becoming and a person who has hardened into a final shape. The people I've met in the last 10 years who frightened me most were not the ones who were violent, or the ones who were difficult, or even the ones like Dak who had decided the world was purely adversarial. The people who frightened me most were the ones who were finished. The ones who had decided, with absolute finality, that they knew everything they were ever going to know about themselves and the world, and who had therefore stopped paying attention to the new information that was constantly arriving. The contradictions, the surprises, the evidence that kept suggesting their model of reality needed adjustment. The military trained me to be finished, certain, solid in my conclusions, quick in my decisions. These are valuable qualities for some situations, and I don't discard them entirely. But the before world produced conditions where that kind of certainty at scale, organizations full of people who were trained to be certain, who were selecting for and rewarding certainty, who were making increasingly consequential decisions with decreasing tolerance for doubt, led to the particular catastrophe that the before world produced. Here I am building something where doubt is not weakness, where saying, "I'm not sure, let's think about this together," is the most respected thing a leader can say, where the willingness to be wrong is the precondition for learning anything. It is slow. The before world built things fast and enormous and interconnected in ways that were astonishing and that produced astonishing things, and also that made it possible for a cascade of catastrophic decisions to propagate through that astonishing interconnected system in ways that normal human perception couldn't track in real time. We are building slowly. One fence post, one crop row, one child learning to read, one conversation between people who might have been enemies deciding to be neighbors instead. I have come to believe, and this is the belief that has replaced the certainties I used to carry, which is to say it is not a certainty but a deep, tested, continually re-examined conviction, that the slowness is not a deficiency. The slowness is the point. The before world was in too much of a hurry, too hurried to look at where it was going, too hurried to listen to the people who were saying slow down, too hurried to notice that the speed itself was the problem, because at certain speeds, you can no longer make corrections before the consequences arrive. We are not in a hurry. I walk out of the feed store into the morning. The air is cold, spring cold, which has a different character than winter cold, a sense of potential underneath it. The sky is the hazy, changed blue-gray. The windmill turns slowly in the morning breeze, unhurried, doing its work. I can hear voices from the cooking area. Miguel's voice and someone else's, Tyler probably, who has taken to helping with the morning fire when his medical schedule allows. Across the settlement, the small sounds of a place that is alive. Water, wood. The chickens deciding it is time to begin their complaints. Rose is already in the school space. I can see the light through the window, one of our electric lights, fed by what the windmill stored yesterday, burning for the morning lesson before the natural light is sufficient. She is early most days. She reads when she is early. Whatever we have, the medical texts, the agricultural references, the histories and novels and technical manuals that our people have brought, found, preserved. She reads all of it with the appetite of someone who understands that knowledge is the most precious resource we have, the one that multiplies when you share it rather than diminishing. She is the future. All of the children are the future. The settlement is the future, imperfect, struggling, occasionally heartbreaking, persistently hopeful. The network of settlements is the future. The slow, difficult work of building trust between communities that have every reason to distrust is the future. I am 47 people's present. I am trying to be worthy of it. I walk toward the cook fire, toward the morning's work, toward the voices and the warmth and the thousand small, essential tasks of keeping alive and making something worth keeping alive for. The weight is still there. I have stopped expecting it to lift, but I carry it differently than I used to, not pressed into my chest, not something I'm walking despite, but integrated. Part of my walking, part of what drives me forward rather than what holds me back. Feel bad, Alina said, and then come help. I help. Every morning I help.